This was a game that was played this very afternoon as part of the chess league that I participate in. So that's a month-long tournament where we play one game a week. I was playing with the white pieces in this game, and my opponent is newer to chess. He's been playing over the board for just a few months, and I think he's been playing online for a year or two. But nevertheless, I thought he played a good game, and I thought it was an instructive game, particularly as it relates to trying to find a plan in the middle game, which is something that everybody struggles with. So that's really what I want to focus on in this game, is talk about how to find a good plan in the middle game. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. I had the white pieces, and I played d4. He played knight f6, c4, and e6. And a long time ago, when I first started playing chess, sort of more seriously, I learned about the Bogo-Indian defense, which is after the move knight c3, black pins the knight with bishop b4. And I don't know much about the Bogo-Indian defense, but at the time, I decided the Bogo-Indian is a good opening. So as white, I don't want to allow black to play that. And I've just been playing this way ever since. I don't allow black to play the Bogo-Indian because I think it's too good. I'd rather him play some other defense. So I avoid the Bogo-Indian by playing the move knight f3, which I believe is actually called the anti-Nimzo opening. So now black has to do something else. Although he didn't want to do something else, he played bishop b4 check anyway. Now this is the Bogo-Indian, which I also don't know much about, but I have more often than the Nimzo since I avoid the Nimzo. So I block the check with my bishop, and I think black has many possible moves here. I was looking at the database earlier and saw that queen e7 is the most common move, just defending the bishop. He decided to trade bishops, and this is probably one of the first big decisions of the game. How do I recapture? I guess not that big of a decision, but we'll call it a decision. I have 4 possible ways to recapture, but I think a couple of them we can rule out pretty easily. King takes is preposterous, so we're not going to take with the king. Taking with this knight doesn't seem to make a lot of sense because the knight's already developed, and these pieces might like to develop. So really, it's between the knight and the queen. I think a lot of players would sort of automatically take with the knight because they see that if you take with the queen, that you're allowing knight e4 with tempo on your queen. And people don't like that. People don't like it when their queen's attacked. But I think that queen takes is actually a fine move. And that's what I played in the game. That's what I always play. And if knight e4 happened, well, black did technically win a tempo. Like, white has to react. But the white queen doesn't really want to be on d2 anyway. The only reason the white queen's on d2 is because she recaptured. So I think white could move to a better square, like c2, for example, where now the knight is under fire. White won back the tempo, and maybe at some later time this queen could do something on the king side, right? So the queen is maybe a little better on c2 than d2 anyway, and now the knights can use d2 if they need to. So knight e4 was not played in the game. He decided to just castle, which I think is a perfectly reasonable move. So I decided to continue developing, and I guess if we want to think about what the best way to continue with development is, we really need to develop the knight and the bishop next. So one possible way to play is to try to develop the bishop by playing like e3 or g3 and giving the bishop a route out. But I decided to develop my knight first, and for a very specific reason. I would really like to play the move e4. That would give white a very powerful pawn center, 3 pawns in the center, and especially these two on e4 and d4, very, very strong. So knight c3 sort of threatens e4, and then that's a better way of getting ready to develop my bishop, because not only am I ready to develop my bishop, but then I'll have this beautiful pawn center. So my opponent correctly prevented me from playing e4. He played the move d5. Now he's controlling e4 too much. I can't play e4. And now we have this very common tension between these two pawns in the center of the board, and we have to decide how we're gonna handle that. So maybe take a moment and think about how you would handle this tension. So our options pretty much whenever there's tension like this is we can release the tension by initiating the capture. We can ignore it. We can ignore the tension altogether, or we can sort of avoid the tension, which in this case would be playing the move c5. So let's tackle these one by one. In the game, I don't think I even like thought about the move c5. Like I don't think I saw that c5 was a legal move. Usually, if you have this sort of structure in the center, you don't want to be relieving the tension by pushing your pawn. You want to have the option, or you want to immediately capture in the center. If you play c5, then now black never has to worry about pressure on d5, and in some cases that might allow black to be able to play like e5, where this pawn isn't under as much pressure. Not in this specific position, but in some cases. And usually black's just going to try to chip away at this c5 pawn. Like it looks nice. Like what if we play e3 and we've got this beautiful pawn chain? Well, black's just going to play b6 later and try to chip away at it. So you're not really going to keep this nice looking pawn chain. So c5 generally not what you want to be doing. So another option would be to just resolve the tension immediately by capturing. And I decided not to do that in this game because I think black would be happy to recapture with this pawn. And that frees up this bishop. The bishop now has a few choices that he didn't have before. When this pawn was camped on e6, the bishop really only has one move, and it's not that inspiring of a move. So I don't want to give this bishop more options. I want to, make it difficult for black to develop in a effective way. So now we're left with just sort of ignoring the tension. And I decided to just defend my pawn. My pawn is attacked. So I defended it with the move e3, and that is going to allow my bishop to develop, and then I can castle, and everything's great. Another thing I considered was just not even defending the pawn at all, and just playing rook c1. And then my argument here is that if he captures, well, he put the pawn on d5 to stop me from playing e4. Now that the d5 pawn is gone, I can play e4. And I think I'm just going to get this pawn back anyway. It doesn't seem like black can really defend it. b5, I can just take it with my knight. So, I think this is a pretty reasonable way for white to play. I decided against it, though. I sort of saw those as my two main options, e3 or rook c1. And I decided for e3 because just thinking about the advantages that each side has, white has more pieces out, 3 pieces to 1 for black. But black has castled, and white hasn't and isn't really close to castling, long. Probably, or castling short, rather. Probably doesn't want to castle long with the c-file looking like it's going to be opened up. So, I thought it was more reasonable to just play e3. I'll develop this bishop soon and be in a position to castle, just in case black decides to start getting aggressive and trying to open the center and attack before I have a chance to castle. So now black, he still has this problem with this bishop, since I didn't allow him to sort of open up this avenue. So he decided that he wanted to develop his bishop this other direction, and he played the move b6. So this was sort of a move that I don't think it's like, terrible or anything, but it sort of gave me some information about, what black's queen side is going to look like. He's sort of defining, the battlefield a little bit on the queen side. So anytime you move a pawn, you're weakening squares. And in this case, the weakened squares are c6 and a6, because now there's no pawn that can control those. Additionally, this pawn on c6 is backward, and a backward pawn on an open file can be a really, really nice target for your pieces, because you can put rooks and try to attack that pawn. So I decided this is the perfect time to actually resolve this tension that we had talked about earlier, and go ahead and capture. So now, if we sort of compare, you know, capturing now versus if we had captured on this turn, a move earlier. Remember, I said if we capture here, I think black will recapture with the pawn, and his bishop has all these. See, it's already ready to go. Already these 3 squares pop up. So after he plays b6 and I capture, if he recaptures with the pawn, which he did, he still has these squares, it's true. But if he develops the bishop to these squares, he's sort of abandoning the light squares on the queen side, which he just weakened by playing b6. So I felt that he probably wouldn't want to do that. You know, he's playing b6 because he wants his bishop over here somewhere. So allowing this diagonal to open up isn't as relevant anymore. That was basically the way I approached it. Now I did sort of think maybe black should have taken with the knight, and the idea with taking with the knight is that he can play bishop b7, and this long diagonal would be open for his light squared bishop, compared to in the game taking with the pawn. Now the bishop is never really impressive on b7 because it's just staring at this pawn. This pawn's probably never really going to be able to move. You know, it's sort of a fixed pawn in the center. So, okay, but he did take with the pawn, and I just developed my bishop. That was the last thing I needed to do, sort of. And that felt like the most aggressive diagonal because I'm pointing, you know, at a potential, you know, target later on. And he played bishop a6, so he wants to just trade these bishops. Pretty reasonable idea. You know, this bishop was sort of struggling to find a role, and with this fixed pawn on a light square in the center, you know, maybe my bishop is going to be more maneuverable than his bishop, so the trade, you know, makes a lot of sense for black from that standpoint. So here's another moment where we have tension in the position, and we have similar options that we had before. We can initiate the exchange, we can avoid the exchange, or we can just ignore it and do other things. So again, I would ask you to think about what you would do to handle this situation. So if we initiate the capture and resolve the tension that way, I think we're just allowing black to develop for free. The knight on a6 isn't that impressive, and you know, maybe I can even tempo it, but you know, I don't like letting the knight and the rook sort of untangle for free. So I'm not a big fan of capturing. If we try to avoid the capture, like if we make the argument that this exchange is favorable for black, therefore we should avoid it, the only way to really do that would be to play like bishop c2. I guess maybe bishop f5. It looks a little loosey-goosey. But now this bishop is actually quite strong. Now I don't think black even wants to trade this bishop, because, I mean, the bishop is hitting at a lot of weak squares in black's camp, and also in white's camp, sorry, and white can't castle. So this doesn't seem like the way to go at all to me. So I didn't want to initiate the trade. I don't want to avoid the trade and let this bishop, you know, carve me up. So I ignored it. You know, this isn't such a big threat. Like, so what? I take with my queen. My queen's probably even better on d3 than on d2, because I have access, you know, to the king side a little bit easier than I do on d2. So I just castled. That's you know, one of the last developing things I needed to do. And another positive about leaving the tension, just maintaining the tension in the position, is the tension is more, it's more awkward for black than for white, because black can't move this knight. If the knight moves, then the bishop is hanging, and if the knight can't move, then the rook can't move. So black's queenside pieces are sort of stuck for the time being. And you could argue, well, white's queen is also stuck, and that's true. But the queen is on an okay square already. The queen already got off the back row so that my rooks can come to whatever file they want to be on. You know, this knight's in the way. The knight needs to develop so that the rook can play. So it's more of a headache for black than for white. And I think for that reason, black decided to just go ahead and trade, which I think makes perfect sense, because we gotta untangle this. So I take back with the queen, and I think my opponent played a bad move here. He was worried about potential eventual threats on h7, which is something a lot of players worry about because they've fallen, they've fallen for that before. So he played the move h6 to sort of cut that out forever. I think this is a bad move because knight g5 is not an imminent threat. Like if it were white's turn and white played knight g5, then black just plays h6, and then white goes back, and then it's black's turn again. So, you don't want to play this move prematurely. If there's something better, usually there's something better you can do. As long as this isn't a big threat, then you probably don't want to be playing moves like h6, h3, a3, a6, because those usually aren't helping you that much otherwise. So I was pretty happy to see the move h6 because I thought now I kind of have a free hand. And this position was actually one of my longer thinks of the game. Not because there's any like, spectacular tactics to figure out, but I just thought it was a good moment to take some time and sort of figure out what my strategy for the rest of the game is going to be. So I'll ask you to do the same thing. You can pause the video and maybe think about how you would want to approach this position as white. So my thoughts on this position were, I think it's a relatively boring position. It doesn't look like white does have a lead in development, but I can't find like an attacking plan for white. Like how, but both kings look pretty safe. I don't know how either side's really going to get in trouble with their king. So we have to try to find other ways to secure an advantage, which is something I think that the newer players struggle with this. Like it's easy to sort of think about attacking plans, like attacking your opponent's king, but it's harder to think about like more longer strategic plans. So the way I would kind of approach it is try to identify some weakness that your opponent has, and then try to figure out the way to attack that weakness. So, one weak point we might think about is the d5 pawn. It's not defended by another pawn. We have some pressure on it already, but it's pretty well defended. So probably can't do much there yet. To me, the most glaring weakness and thing I would like to try to attack is the c7 pawn. Because as I said earlier, it's a backward pawn. It's on a half-open file. I can put all my major pieces and try to attack that pawn. I can play knight b5 and try to attack that pawn. So I think this is the most tempting target. And there's other weaknesses on the queen side. There's sort of just a little bit of general weakness on the queen side because this b6 move was played, so a6 and c6 are what we would call a hole in black's position. So we want to attack on the queen side, I think, which, like I said, is kind of not something that newer players will think about sometimes because they're really focused on, I want to try to checkmate. But there's other ways to win at chess. Okay, so let's think about how do we try to attack on the queen side. The c7 pawn is the most tempting target, so it would be really natural to just say, okay, I'm going to bring a rook over. One of these rooks, I'm just going to double on the c file, and black's going to, have to be stuck defending this. And that is probably fine. But I thought that black might be able to play the move c5. If I let black play c5, then I'm not sure that the pawn is as weak anymore. I would really like the pawn to remain on c7 and try to attack it there. Or if it has to go to c6, fine. But somewhere where it doesn't have another pawn defending it. If he can play c5, even though I'm getting this exchange, he has these like hanging pawns that are sometimes weak. But that felt a little easier to defend than just this backward pawn on c7 to me. So my move in this position was aimed to try to keep this pawn weak and backward as long as possible. So I played the move b4. I didn't want him to play c5. And I thought there were some ways he could try to force the move c5 in, like knight d7 or something. But I'm ready to play b5 and just clamp down and say, you're never going to be able to move that c pawn. So his reaction was to play a5. Here's another moment where we have that tension and we have to decide, are we going to initiate the exchange? Are we going to avoid the tension? Are we going to just let it sit? So yeah, again, you can think about what you would do. And I think the best answer here is, it's related to why we played the move b4 in the first place. We wanted to keep this pawn fixed backward where we could attack it and weak. So if we capture, he captures with the rook, we've sort of lost our grip on c5, and we activated his rook. His rook's putting pressure on this isolated pawn. So we definitely don't want to capture. That wouldn't be good. We could maybe ignore the tension, but he is attacking our pawn. So I guess to ignore it, we would have to play like a3. And that might be fine, but after this, now this pawn is isolated. Black has the option of trading some pieces if he wants to. She might want to do to try to, just get to a drawish in game. So I don't love that either. So I think in this case, the correct answer is to avoid the tension. This is an instance where the tension is not benefiting us. We want to keep our control, over the queen side. So I played b5, and I'm still cutting out the move c5. I mean, it can be played, but I'm trying to advance on the queen side. So I thought maybe he would play c6 or c5 here, because it's clear that this pawn is going to be the target now. And basically my idea was, if he plays c5, I could just take, and now I have a passed pawn, and I can play a4. I was thinking about playing a4 right away and just saying I have a protected passed pawn, and if we get to an endgame, you're going to be at a big disadvantage because I have this very strong pawn. And if he played c6, I was thinking similar, just play a4. I guess he could take, but then my knight's coming to a good square. Now the b pawn is the weak backward pawn. So one way or another, I'm gonna have an advantage on the queen side, I thought, after this b4 b5 plan. Okay, so let's see what he did in the actual game. He played rook e8, and I thought the reason he played rook e8 is because he wants to put his knight on e4. Previously, if he put the knight on e4, I have too many defenders or attackers, whichever. I have two things defending e4, he only has one. So that would lose a pawn if he played knight e4. So rook e8, he's trying to establish this knight on e4. So my next move was aimed at preventing that, and I played knight e5, and I'm obstructing the rook's vision of the e4 square. So if knight e4 is played, I can just take and win a pawn. Hooray for me. Yeah, and then he played the move queen d6, which I had not foreseen queen d6 at all, but I really think it's a great move. And I sort of, when it was played, I was kind of scratching my head like, what's that move about? But it makes a lot of sense, I think. So, he still has this problem on the queen side where he hasn't developed anything. If he decides to develop his knight, he could get into some trouble. He gave up the c6 square. Yeah, and actually, I mean, just looking at this, if I play knight c6, the queen can't go here. So the queen has to play queen c8, which is looking really, really unpleasant. And I think probably here I'm thinking about the move queen f5 and just trying to take the d pawn. That might not quite work because maybe this knight can go to f8 or something. But I mean, it's clear that black's position is very cramped and white is sort of having all the fun here. I'm trying to remember, I was trying to figure out if there's some way I can capture and get any kind of advantage, but I don't think. I was hoping I could capture and then win this pawn, but I think he would just take with the queen and defend the d pawn. So after queen d6, this is maybe a little more tempting, because now knight c6 isn't coming with tempo. The queen is not getting trapped in the corner. The queen can go somewhere. So I mean, the queen is just, it's just better on d6 than d8. He can even come and annoy me on the queen side if I start drifting away with my queen, which I was planning to do. So I think queen d6 was a good move. I really didn't think about it at all, and I didn't appreciate the ideas until later, to be honest. I kind of thought like maybe he's thinking about one day, doing some checkmate threat, and I was like, I don't think that's never gonna happen. So Okay, anyway. Yeah, this is another actually a good position to ask you guys to think about when it comes to like middle game planning. So if we sort of follow the model that I laid out before, which is like try to identify some weaknesses and try to put pressure on those weaknesses, then if you can do that in this position, then you will find the move that I played, and that luckily for me happens to be the move the computer says is best. So how do we try to sort of start poking at some weaknesses? Well, the weaknesses that I have in mind, I mean, I guess C7 is still kind of weak, but we're kind of far away from putting pressure on that. F7 is a weakness. It's not defended by anything but the king, and we already have some pressure there. And this D5 pawn is sort of always going to be a little weak because it can't be defended by this C pawn. So really, I mean, just by identifying those two weaknesses and thinking about what move can we make that is sort of keeping an eye on both of them, we can find Queen F5 as a candidate move. And that happens to be the best move, and I did find the move in the game. And not only are we sort of we're x-raying these weaknesses, so like now this knight is effectively pinned. But I was also thinking about, well, what does black want to do? Black wants to get rid of this knight. Black really would like to play the move knight BD7 and try to kick me out. So by playing Queen F5, I'm actually stopping knight B to D7. If he plays knight BD7, then I'm going to end up winning a pawn one way or another. I can take the knight, and then if he takes with the queen, then I just exchange and I win a pawn. Hooray for me. And this is weak and probably indefensible. Like, for example, rook over, this rook over, and what are you doing to defend? Yeah, you're just going to end up down 2 pawns. So you can't defend that way. And if you take with the knight, then I can just capture the pawn because I have 2 attackers. You only have 1 defender. I don't know which way to capture is best, but one way or another, I'm taking a pawn, and this pawn's still backward and weak. So Queen F5 prevents what he wants to do, and it's keeping an eye, or sort of starting to get in the neighborhood of some of Black's weaknesses. So he didn't like my queen on F5, and I can't blame him. So he decided to try to kick my queen away, and he played G6. And now I found myself extremely tempted, because the tactical wizards among you will notice that I can play knight takes G6. If he takes back, I take with the queen, check. And then no matter where he goes, I can take this pawn with check. So that's 3 pawns for my knight. So what do you guys think about that variation? Is this something that white should go for? So I decided to not play knight takes G6. And it's really tempting because we're getting 3 pawns for the knight. The black king has no pawn shelter. But if we think about this position at the end, I haven't looked at this with the computer. I haven't looked at this variation, so I actually don't know what the computer is going to say. But if we look at the position here, so it looks like the computer's reading equal-ish. By the way, when I was analyzing, I thought he had to play king f8. And then, for example, here, I don't know if king e7 is good, but just for example, if we evaluate the position, we got 3 pawns for our knight, but look at our pieces. We have a queen that's pretty active, but these rooks are doing nothing. This knight is not really doing anything. So, meh. I mean, the computer's still giving an advantage for white, but, you know, I just felt like I'm trading off one of my best pieces. Like, yeah, I'm opening up his king, but I think it's better to just sort of, you know, I have an advantage in activity. I don't want to trade that away. So after G6, I decided, hey, again, let's try to target another weakness. He just moved this pawn. That created a weakness on H6. So queen H3. So now we're keeping an eye. You know, we're threatening this weak pawn. We're threatening to just win the pawn outright. And after the game, when I was talking to my opponent, he said that he had no idea what to do here. He was just totally unsure of what to do. and you know, it makes sense. It's a tough position because now I've sort of created a bit of an initiative on the queen side. The king is also getting loosened up. I've forced him to make some pawn moves. I suggested after the game that I thought the best move was king g7, defending this and keeping that, you know, defended from the knight. He decided that he wanted to sort of, you know, get developed and get active finally. So he developed his knight. He played knight b d7. And my eyes kind of lit up because, hey, I was attacking this pawn, man, and you didn't defend it. So I might take your pawn, you know. Now if I take the pawn first, then he might win a pawn here, right? So as much as I like this knight, and as much as I liked having these knights sort of bottled up for most of the game, I decided to sort of cash in and play knight takes knight. And no matter how he recaptures, I'm capturing on h6 next. And that's what happened. Now, the computer pointed out something even better, which I didn't even really think about, and this is something that I want to learn from this game, is, you know, again, if we sort of just evaluate the position, like, if we're thinking about this trade, which knight is better? Obviously the white knight. Like, the white knight is on the 5th rank, this knight is on the 2nd rank for black. The knight is putting pressure on, you know, potentially vulnerable squares near black's king. And this knight has no moves. Like, the knight can't do anything real. I mean, okay, it can go to f8. But, you know, this knight is not a very active piece. And the move that the computer suggests here makes it to where the knight cannot even exchange itself. So that's a little hint for you. So what can white play to where this knight can't even initiate the exchange, which is why he played this in the first place. So hopefully with that hint, you found the move that I missed, which was f4. And now if he takes the knight, then he's losing material. He's losing a knight. So f4 just keeps this knight super glued, and it's really uncomfortable for black. White has such a big space advantage. You know, black has weaknesses that white can play against, and white's position seems pretty perfect. So yeah, unfortunately I missed f4. But what I did also gives white a clear advantage. We're just up a pawn effectively for nothing. And, you know, I think my opponent a little bit unraveled here. And it is a very difficult position because, like I said, I mean, eventually we are just going to start putting pressure on this weakness. And, you know, white has a pretty clear plan, and it's not really clear what black should try to do. So I think he decided he didn't like my queen being here, which can't really blame him. Pardon me. So he tried to kick my queen out with queen f8. And this actually just makes it a fairly simple win from here. So hopefully you see the way forward to get a winning position. And that is, it's another case of tension, and we decide what do we want to do about it. So in this case, the best is to resolve the tension, initiate the capture ourselves, and no matter which way he recaptures, this pawn is hanging. So that queen was defending the pawn. So the way to identify this tactic is just to be positionally aware when you're playing of, hey, this pawn is only defended by the queen. You know, just sort of take notice of what's defending what, and then when something moves, you're like, wait a minute, what was that piece defending? What was it doing? So when the queen moves, the pawn's undefended, and, you know, I can just, I mean, I had so much pressure, I had a lot of space, I had better pieces, but if I can trade them off and be in an in-game up 2 pawns, I'm probably going to do that every time, because the in-game up 2 pawns is usually going to be a pretty simple win, unless there's some extenuating circumstances. In this case, it's even better than a 2-pawn advantage because there's no way to save this pawn. At least I haven't fully looked at it with the computer. But we're threatening the pawn right now with a big fork, so like you can't just ignore it. And, you know, he moved his rook to defend it in the game. But now, you know, we bring our rook to c1. And then, yeah, I don't know how you defend that pawn now. So it was 2 pawns. It's going to become 3 pawns. and it's just too much now. And also, once this pawn falls, this pawn's weak. White has a pass pawn. White has a monster 5 versus 2 pawn majority. It'll take time, but you know, as long as White doesn't make any big mistakes, White will convert and win this 10 times out of 10. So he played on, which I don't blame him at all. He tried to complicate the position and make it, you know, muddy the waters, which is absolutely what he should do and what anyone should do when they're in this kind of position. You don't want to just play out, you know, you don't want the game to be easily winning. You want to try to make it complicated. So he played c6. He's going to lose the pawn anyway. I took with the pawn. Yeah, and now unfortunately he doesn't. You know, things are just getting worse because the knight is attacked. The knight can't go to a lot of squares because I got those covered. I got these covered, and you know, these squares are blocked. So the only square for the knight is to go to b8, which was not played in the game, due to the fact that if knight b8 happens, I can just play c7. The knight's hit again, and after the knight moves, I think the computer gave knight a6. Yeah, it did. But after knight a6, I believe I can just take this. Well, I could. I guess it's better to keep defending it. Maybe I play like rook c6. That looks kind of good. Let's see what does the computer say. Rook a b1. That makes sense too. That makes more sense. Yeah, I think the computer's better than me. Bring a new piece in, put pressure on that pawn. So yeah, I mean, one way or another, it's really falling apart for black. So again, he tried to make things a little more complicated. He played rook e6. I said thank you for the knight. Now the rook's attacked and promotion is looming. He traded rooks and he played rook d6, forking my knight and my pawn. But this is a pattern that you should recognize in a lot of in-games. Open back rank, pawn on the 7th. You can get the rook down there with check, and now you're supporting the pawn advance. So we played out a couple more moves, but he ended up resigning here. So I think it was a pretty good game. I mean, especially considering that my opponent was 1,000 points lower rated, and he's relatively new. So you know, it wasn't so much that, you know, I understood tactics and he didn't. It was just sort of a slow, like, you know, just a strategic. Eventually I, you know, outplayed him over many moves. And you know, I think a lot of newer players forget that it's possible to win a game of chess that way. It's not all tactics all the time. So h6 I think is maybe the move that, you know, deserves the most attention for black. Like that's, I think, a pretty bad move just because it's sort of like passing and giving white a free move. And otherwise, I mean, you know, white has a lot of pressure here, but it's not anything, it's not an immediate material edge. And then I think here the pressure just got to be too much, and he, you know, missed that there were ways that I had of just winning some pawns, and I was able to basically trade one advantage for another. I was able to trade my superior position for a material advantage and just get a pretty easily winning in game. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that helped sort of give some ideas of how to try to find plans in the middle game, try to notice where your opponent's weak and think about what you need to do to hone in on those weaknesses as much as you can and apply as much pressure as you can. If you enjoyed the video, please, you know, like and subscribe and do all that YouTube stuff that everybody is always yelling at you about. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Bye.